Right now, Moby, as you know, is joining me here in Studio Q. I'm excited to get into this. It's got to be a sign of a full life if you can fold an entire memoir with just 10 years of stories. Why did you decide to zero in on those years, 1989 to 1999?
Yeah, because traditionally I thought that an autobiography was supposed to cover an entire life. I also thought that autobiographies and memoirs were supposed to be written by very old people. And I'm old, but I'm not very old yet. And either very old people, politicians, or reality TV stars. And then a few years ago, it seemed like suddenly lots of young-ish musicians were writing memoirs. I mean, Patti Smith wrote the amazing Just Kids, and then Bob Dylan wrote Chronicles. And so it seemed like the goal for a memoir changed a little bit. Like rather than cover an entire life, it became almost this like contextual period. Like you're writing about yourself, but you're also very much putting yourself specifically in like a temporal and geographic context. And so in this book, it's about me because it's a memoir, but it's also very much about New York in the late 80s, in the early 90s, not just what the club scene was like, but New York at the time was ravaged by, crack violence. People were dying left and right of AIDS. The city was burning every night. It was a really ostensibly dystopian place, but it was also sort of like paradise.
Yeah, what was it that you fell in love with? Because you're describing in this book, you don't shy away from the crack dealers, the drug addiction, all the things you just described. What was it that you fell in love with the city of New York in that time?
It's such a good question. And partially, it's just that I was young. Like I was 22 years old. And when you're 22 years old, like that sordid dysfunction is kind of liberating. And also the fact that it was so inexpensive. The book opens and I'm paying $50 a month to a security guard to look the other way so I can squat in an abandoned factory in a crack neighborhood. And when you don't have to worry about paying rent, you're free to experiment as much as you want. Like I feel badly for people who move to big cities now, like a 20-year-old who moves to New York or London or San Francisco or Toronto, they have to worry about every month making enough money just to pay the rent. And I think that leads to a lot of artistic compromise. But when you're 22 and your rent is $50 a month, you can experiment as much as you want. And there are just really no consequences.
What's it like for you nowadays when you walk around New York, seeing what it's become?
So I was talking about this with my girlfriend, and I used an expression that was so pretentious, but it was the only way I could describe it, is like when I walk around New York now, I feel like a Proustian ghost because I was born in New York in 1965, and I've been wandering around New York. I mean, I live in LA now, but now when I go back to New York, physically, it's very similar. It's the same streets, a lot of the same buildings, but it's very odd because it's also a completely different place. Like demographically, it's finance workers and tourists. And I'm not maligning finance workers and tourists, but when I was growing up in New York, it was artists, writers, musicians, drug dealers, drug addicts. And it was a very different place. So it's confusing to go back to a place that largely looks the same and largely smells the same, but is a different
It's so
place.
fundamentally different.
It's almost a little bit like Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Wow.
Where like you encounter Donald Sutherland as a body snatcher, and he's like the same person, except now he's been taken over by aliens.
So you described the city of New York in this book. You also described the music world that you came up in the early 90s, New York club world, a setting kind of legendary for tales of drugs and debauchery. And you saw that world as a sober DJ. So you probably have clearer memories than most. How do you remember that scene?
Well, there were a few different scenes that were sort of coexisting. One was the hip-hop world. And so I had my crate of hip-hop records. So sometimes I'd be DJing at hip-hop clubs. And then there was like the gay, African-American, Latino world. So I had my crate of house music that I would go to DJ in gay
Still
clubs.
had to carry crates, of course, yeah.
Put them on skateboards and wheel them around. And then there was the burgeoning rave scene. And so I would DJ based on whatever night of the week it was. I'd be DJing at one of these events or sometimes DJing at sex parties and after-hours events. And what made it really odd is at that time, I was a very serious Christian and I was very sober. So I'd find myself DJing at 6 o'clock in the morning to people who were out of their mind on drugs.
It's one of the most fascinating things about this book.
It was It was odd, but one of the odder things is that it just made perfect sense to me. Like, so I'd be teaching Bible study during the day and DJing at sex clubs at night, and somehow it just made sense.
Well, there is something very
Yeah.
Christian about that.
I guess, I mean, because I wasn't necessarily taking part in the debauchery. I was just there in love with the music, in love with the culture. And I guess it depends on what your basis for, like, how you evaluate ethics, like your criteria for determining ethical or unethical behavior. And to me, if someone is harming someone else, that's unethical. You know, if someone is forcing their will upon another person or another creature, that's ethical. But if someone is just trying to find something, whether it's hedonism or debauchery or alcohol or drugs, that just sort of helps them to deal with their experience of the human condition better, it almost seems like that's not ethical, because they're only harming themselves. I mean, it's not unethical, I mean.
Did you have that rationale at the time, or is that kind of you looking back in retrospect saying, I think this is what I was seeing?
Well, this is one of the interesting things about going around and talking about this book, because for the last 26 years when I've done promotional tours, I'm talking about records, or talking about music, or talking about politics. And this is really odd because the book is very personal. So I'm going around having these therapy sessions, essentially, and talking about myself and having to almost like figure out how to talk about things that seemed normal to me at the time, and in hindsight were really, really weird.
It's amazing. So you came up at the same time as acts like The Prodigy, Chemical Brothers, Fatboy Slim. What did it feel like to be on the inside of this musical movement that was breaking?
It was, and I'm sure that there are a bunch of people listening right now who will relate to this, but it was magical because there were no big corporations involved and everything was being invented by us. You know, the equipment was new, the genres were new, every aspect of it was being self-generated. You know, I'm hesitant to use the DIY acronym, but it really was DIY. Like, if you wanted to wear clothes, you started a clothing company. If you wanted to make records, you started a recording studio and started a record company. If you wanted to have events, you became a promoter. Like, everything was self-generated and brand new. Like, we were making music that hadn't existed 2 years beforehand and wearing clothes that hadn't existed 6 months beforehand. So, and the fact that there really was no corporate patronage. And also, this was pre-internet, so no one outside of that world really knew what was going on. So it felt very kind of magical and special, especially since then, because not much has happened since then that is truly sort of sheltered and DIY. Like, there's almost always some sort of corporate involvement or broader awareness of something, especially now. Like, you start a scene in New Zealand and 30 seconds later, everybody in the world knows what that scene is. Like, things don't really have the space to germinate the way they did back then.
That this might be the last example of that because it was just pre-internet.
I mean, also, I mean, my perspective is skewed because I'm 50 years old now. And so there's always a danger in, like, a 50-year-old guy waxing nostalgic about things from his youth. You know, like, I might be over-romanticizing stuff simply because I was young and I lived through it.
You give some great descriptions in here of your early shows, making your early records, the joy, you know, first encounters with heroes, you know, the joy of that, but also the anxiety of that that comes with that urgency. Do you miss that? I mean, it's a mixed bag emotionally, but do you miss the stakes being that high?
I guess on one hand, I do. I mean, I miss the sort of the sense of potential. And what I mean by that, and this is going to sound like a real old guy thing to say, but it's like every year after 10, you know, when you're 10 years old, you can be anything. You can be the world's best athlete. You can be a prime minister. You can be an astronaut. And then, like, every year after that, potential sort of wanes a little bit, which isn't necessarily sad. It's just a function of aging and the human condition. So now, like, I'm 50 years old. There's a very good chance I will never be president. I'll never be an amazing athlete, et cetera. But you accept that, and hopefully you get some sense of solidarity with everybody else on the planet who's going through a similar thing. So what I kind of miss was that experience of being 22 or 23 and having no idea what was going to happen next. And so now, I mean, I think life is remarkable, but more nuanced in a way. You know, there aren't as many big, broad strokes, you know, as you get older.
Well, in terms of what happens next in this book, Porcelain has an interesting arc because the style of music that you love in 91, 92, and you're participating in, it peaks kind of early. And a darker music kind of takes over for the joyful sort of techno that you created. What was that moment like when everything changed musically really quickly?
For me, it was a little heartbreaking. So basically what happened was when the rave scene started, it was all about hugging and euphoria and celebration and joy. And you would go to these events and everybody was smiling and hugging each other. And then like a year later, the drugs changed and it went from ecstasy to ketamine. And suddenly the music got darker and it was still good music. It was still very interesting music, but it wasn't joyful anymore. It was almost like people were ashamed of the fact that they had been innocent and happy a year before. And went to this other extreme of like playing super dark music and not smiling and not hugging. And honestly, it kind of broke my heart because it was so unprecedented and unique to have these huge groups of largely Caucasian people celebrating and hugging and sort of transcending their like waspy reserve and actually having emotions in public.
Was that something you'd never seen growing up, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up this uptight, poor white trash waspy kid in Connecticut, and like the only emotions I was around when I was growing up were like cynicism, humor, occasional anger, and like fake gratitude on Christmas. You know, so that's when I discovered like African American dance music, Latino dance music, the gay club scene, the rave scene. These were about like unapologetic joy and unapologetic feeling. And that's what I fell in love with. So it almost, to me, didn't matter what the genre was or how the music was being made. What mattered was sort of the way in which I and other people resonated with the music emotionally. And it was really, I remember around 93 or 94 feeling this sense of actual like palpable loss. Like, oh, the music is still good, but it's not joyful anymore.
In more unpredictable turns, I mean, you then release an album of intense punk influenced rock, Animal Rights. That was in 1996. Not particularly well received by critics or fans. Why do you think you went in that direction at that point? Was it the heartbreak of watching the scene turn?
I remember having this one weird experience. I was playing a festival in Denmark, and I was in the dance tent. And the dance tent was very nice, but it was very polite. Like it was like interesting musicians like LFO, Orbital, Saint Etienne. It was very nice. But no one was dancing and no one was smiling. And they were making great music, but it was very academic.
Okay.
And then I walked over to the main stage and the band Biohazard were playing. And they're this punk rock speed metal band and people were dancing and jumping up and down and it was so passionate. And I was just so captivated by that because I had grown up in the hardcore punk world. And so I simply thought, okay, I'm a musician, and I thought by definition, musicians were supposed to do things differently. You know, because when I was growing up, you know, Joe Strummer from The Clash made hip-hop and made reggae, and John Lennon made Revolution No. 9 and the Plastic Ono Band, and Neil Young made trance, and I thought musicians were supposed to try different things. So I made this very difficult punk rock record called Animal Rights, and was received about as badly as a record can be received. And I found myself suddenly playing concerts to literally 50 people a night. Like I played this one concert in Paris on the Animal Rights Tour where we sold 60 tickets, and by the end of the show, there were about 20 people there. So it was a pretty dark period.
Yeah, how did that all affect you personally? I mean, you're still a young man at that point. You're in your mid-20s.
Well, there were other factors that made it even darker. You know, because I was battling alcoholism at this point, having constant panic attacks, and my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and then she died. And then I lost my record deal. So it was like sad upon sad upon sad upon sad. And my response to it was to just like drink more. That's what but that's like the alcoholic's response to everything. Like when things are good, drink more. When things are bad, drink more.
What was it like to write about that chapter of your life? I mean, it's difficult to read at points. Some of the behavior gets out of control. What was it like to put that down on the page?
It was very. I think it's a really great question, and I want to have an equally great answer. But it was actually just a nice experience, and I would encourage everyone, if you can, to at some point try to write about your past, especially like a distant past, because then you regain objectivity that you clearly don't have as you're going through something. And so it was nice to look back at myself with this quasi-objectivity, and actually the response that I had was almost a sense of like compassion and sympathy. Looking back at myself and being like, oh, you poor guy, like that was actually pretty rough. And hopefully from that you can engender like a sense of compassion, sympathy for yourself as you're going through things now.
I wonder if you'd find that same compassion if you were writing about a closer time period. Do you think part of it is the distance?
Oh yeah, absolutely distance.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm writing about something that happened 20 years ago, so you don't feel as much of a personal investment. And also, since then, so I put out this weird album, Animal Rights, and it failed completely. But then the book ends right before the album Play came out. And at that point, I was convinced that my career had ended. I had been dropped by my record label, but I was going to put out this record Play on a friend's record label. I was broke. I thought I was going to move back to Connecticut to teach community college, and that this was going to be my last record. And so it's really interesting, and you have almost a degree of omniscience when you write about the past to try and revisit how you felt about something when it was happening, compared and contrasted to your perspective on it now, which is really why, regardless of whether if you're, a musician or a transit worker, or if you manage a Starbucks, just like writing some sort of memoir can be like one of the best forms of like self-diagnostic.
When you were writing, were you trying to, what's my question here? Kind of, there's the facts of what happens and there's the feelings that you were feeling at that time. How hard was it to remember what you felt?
It's an interesting question because like the facts I think are mildly interesting, and you need the facts for context. But I read some other musician memoirs and I found them to be a little bit too fact and detail oriented and kind of stingy with emotion. And so I realized what I was responding to in other people's memoirs or other people's autobiographies was less fact and more emotion, more feeling. And so I had to remind myself of that you can't, like you can describe a scene, but if you actually can like present how you were feeling at that time, that tends to be where sort of like the emotional resonance of the work resides.
How hard was it to remember what your faith was like at that time? You talked about being a Christian, sober DJ, and spirituality for everyone evolves over time. How hard was it to remember what that was giving you at that time?
I mean, faith, and I'm only going to talk about myself very subjectively, because clearly faith is an intense issue for a lot of people. But basically, my rigid faith in the late 80s and early 90s was a product of insecurity. Like I found this faith that enabled me to make sense of a very complicated world. And eventually, and I sort of touch on this in the book, like eventually I rediscovered just how complicated the world and the universe are. And I realized that faith is fine, but you can't have a human faith that accurately describes a 15 billion year old universe that's vast beyond our understanding. So when I deal with fundamentalists now, I sort of understand like the root of fundamentalism is fear and insecurity, because you're trying to make sense of a baffling, complicated universe. And you're also, there's that ancient tribalism, like it's very comforting and atavistic and ultimately very dangerous to be a part of a group of people who are like-minded and feel that everyone else is wrong. Like When you look at
I
human
think
history,
we all
yeah,
fall into that, don't we?
and it's easy, and sometimes it's benign. You know, like, oh, someone likes the Raptors, someone doesn't. Like that's pretty benign tribalism. But when it starts to become religious tribalism and religious fundamentalism, where people are actually willing to like violently impose their beliefs on other people, that's when clearly it becomes very dangerous.
So as you said, this book signs off as you're demoing the songs that would eventually make up Play, the biggest album of your career, although at that point you thought that album was going absolutely nowhere. Now looking back, what's the biggest thing you learned in those 10 years that helped you once your star rose to even greater heights?
The biggest thing I learned, I hope I've learned something. I think the biggest thing, and this might seem really platitudinal or self-evident, but one of the biggest things I've learned is the things that you want and the things that you believe are going to make you happy rarely do. And the things that you avoid and the things that you think are going to make you miserable sometimes are a lot more complicated and can actually make you happy. What I mean by that is like I assumed when I was growing up that if I lived in New York and I had a record deal and I was making records, that I would just be the happiest person on the planet. And actually, at times I was happy, but at times I was completely miserable. So I just learned that there isn't that clear linear relationship between what you long for and its ability to make you happy.
What about the other side of that, of what you just described, something that kind of makes you miserable that you realize is more complicated? And like, what's something in your story that you realize this is actually a source of some joy?
Oddly enough, I'm trying to write a book about that. It's
So
not
that's
about me. It's a book. It's the working title, and I haven't gotten very far. And it's called Repurposing Adversity.
Okay.
Because if you look at human history, oftentimes people's worst moments end up being their best moments. You know, and a classic example would be Al Gore when he lost the 2000 election. Like he had 1 million more votes than G.W. Bush, but he lost the election because the Supreme Court took it away from him. That's a pretty low moment. But then he went on to make An Inconvenient Truth. He won a Nobel Prize. He won an Academy Award. He then joined the boards of Pixar and Apple. So by 2006, he's a Nobel Prize-winning, Academy Award-winning, very wealthy, successful, revered person. And at that point, G.W. Bush had an approval rating of about 15%. So sometimes what you don't want is the thing that's going to deliver the most well-being.
I could talk to you for a while longer, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, my pleasure.
And congrats on the book.